Okay, so moving on to the intentions that I have for this webinar. First of all, I want to talk a little bit about how in NARM we hold and define developmental trauma, how we hold that concept. Then we'll look at what it is that produces the symptoms that people suffer from in response to developmental trauma. And we will also look briefly at clinical application of the NARM model. So how do we work in NARM with the things that people come to us for, symptoms, problems. And finally, we'll also look at how NARM is different from other therapeutic approaches that work with developmental trauma. And if all goes well, then at the end, this will take us hopefully about 45 minutes. And if that goes well, then at the end, we'll have about a 15-minute time for questions and answer. Speaking of which, if questions come up for you while I present, you're most welcome to put them in the chat, and then hopefully I can address them toward the end of the session. And there will hopefully also be time for us to have some short chats also with those of you who'd like that. So again, NARM, the Neuro-Affective Relational Model, a cutting-edge, relatively new developmental trauma therapy created by Dr. Lawrence Heller. He started teaching this, I believe, in 2011. So it's relatively new, but it's moving on strongly. It's expanding. More and more people want to train in it. And personally, I have to say, I think it's definitely the most sophisticated and most effective developmental trauma therapy out there. As you can see in that blue box, this model can be applied to a whole variety of kinds of trauma, especially types of trauma where the sense of identity, the sense of self in the person changes, as in how the person, comes to think about themselves, as well as their physiology. And really by far the strongest focus of NARM is on developmental trauma. And as we'll come to see, in NARM, we address both these levels that I just spoke of, both the identity level, which we call top-down, as well as the body nervous system level, called bottom-up. We work with both. Moving on from here to the next slide. So just to summarize that again, in NARM, we have a very sophisticated way of combining psychodynamic elements and a body-based approach that has a deep understanding of the functioning of the nervous system and the impact of trauma on the nervous system. There's also a very strong relational element in the power of this work, right? One of the 4 letters is relational. So that's a huge element in this work. Mainly, I would say the presence and the relational capacity of the therapist is extremely important. We could go much deeper into this. Some of you may be familiar with the field of what's called interpersonal neurobiology, the work of Dan Siegel and others. That'd be like a theoretical framework for that aspect of NARM. What is commonly called mindfulness is also innate to the NARM approach, as we work very much with ongoing moment-to-moment presence and curiosity about what's unfolding in the moment. And so both in our own experience as well as in the client's experience. So very mindfully tracking what's happening in the moment, as opposed to coming from concepts. And phenomenological here means that we inquire with the client how they construct their sense of self and identity, and how they construct their experience of reality moment by moment. It may sound a little abstract, but I hope it'll become clearer. And the other framework that I want to touch on in this slide here is that NARM actually can be understood as a therapy that can help resolve so-called ACEs, adverse childhood experiences. And we'll take a look at that in a moment, what that refers to, as well as complex PTSD, complex post-traumatic stress disorder. So those are two well-known phrases that have now become more and more popular in our field. So NARM is very powerful in treating those conditions. Some of you may have heard about the Adverse Childhood Experiences study, some not. So let's take a brief look at that, because it's a gateway for us to get into what developmental trauma actually is. So the ACEs study, I forgot when exactly it was first done, I believe in the late 80s or early 90s, was a long-term study where they related the number of adverse childhood experiences that a person had. And these can be experiences such as shock trauma or also neglect and abuse. They related the number of these adverse childhood experiences that a person had with long-term consequences on physical, mental, emotional, relational health. And these studies have been duplicated numerous times, and the results are really striking. What they found is, just in a very global summary, is that early developmental trauma has a very significant long-term impact on a multitude of health markers in a person's life, right up to a significant reduction of lifespan, actually. So it's quite impressive. If you ever want to take the time to go to the details of this, it's really impressive. And this study, the ACEs study, really helped bring into public awareness the extremely harmful long-term consequences of developmental trauma. So let's look now in the next slide at how developmental trauma comes into being and how we understand the origins of developmental trauma from a NARM perspective. So let's look at an ideal case of a child growing up with attuned, stable, loving caregivers, usually the parents, but it could be other people too, in an atmosphere of support and healthy relationships. In NARM, looking at the left column here on that slide, in NARM, we recognize and acknowledge 5 fundamental developmental needs that a child has growing up at the very beginning of life. Now, of course, these needs won't become obsolete after early childhood. These are needs that we have throughout our lifespan, but there are very specific, crucial windows in the child's development where these specific needs come online, like critical windows. And those needs are in sequential order. I think somebody may have their mic on, so if you can all please unmute yourself, that'd be great. So in sequence, these needs are for connection, for attunement, for trust and healthy interdependence, for autonomy, and then the last one is for like a healthy integration of love and sexuality. Now, if these needs are being adequately met by the caregivers, by the parents usually, then the child will develop the capacities that are listed on the right-hand side of the slide. And just to put in one detail here, this doesn't mean that the needs have to be, or those core needs have to be met 100% perfectly at any given moment. As a matter of fact, what they've found in attachment studies is that, like, if there's just 1/3 of the time that the parents are really attuned to the child, that's actually enough to produce what we call secure attachment. So like a stable sense of self. So all parents out here among you, relax. You don't have to get it right all the time. 1/3 of the time is enough of proper attunement and being kind of in sync with our children. So coming back to the slide, if those core needs are adequately met, then the child will develop those capacities. They will have a strong and solid sense of self. They will have a basic trust in themselves and in life in general. They will have an ability to be present to themselves, to their life, connected to their bodies, emotions, in a sense of aliveness. They have a capacity for self-regulation and also for healthy relationships as well as intimacy. So this is the ideal case. Let's look at the less than ideal case where developmental trauma actually unfolds from. So we call a scenario environmental failure in NARM, a scenario where the parents fail to provide adequate nurturing and attunement to the young child as he or she grows up. This can come, of course, in a huge variety of scenarios. Anything from chronic misattunement, or just an overall atmosphere where the child grows up in that's just not supportive, right up to variations of abuse and neglect. But we don't have to go into the exact specifics here. So in an environment of environmental failure, there's a whole different dynamic that then ends up happening. So let's look at one key dynamic here for all children. So like a young child is obviously 100% dependent on their caregivers for their survival, right? Young children cannot survive on their own. So they're 100% dependent for survival on their parents, which of course means that these relationships, usually to the parents, are of critical importance to the child, and they need to be protected at all costs, any cost. So they have priority over anything else. So what that means is that by definition, the child has to protect the attachment relationship, which means the relationship to their parents, over anything. And that also means that the child will have to do whatever it takes to fit in, to make themselves as acceptable and as lovable as possible, even if, and actually especially if, the parents are not attuned or even hostile or stressed out or any number of these difficult dynamics. Yeah. So the child will read the environment, especially the parents, of course, and try to figure out what parts of him or herself are welcome and what parts of him or herself are not welcome. And in reading the environment that way, the child will then adapt in whatever ways he or she can to try and fit in and to try and secure the love of the parents and the safety of the attachment relationship. And for this, the child has to develop what we call strategies. And strategies are ways of behaving that are purely intended to make sure the love of the parents keeps flowing. And as part of these strategies, the child will then learn to reject their own authentic core needs and disconnect from authentic parts of him or herself. If that's a little global and abstract right now, we'll take a closer look at that in a moment and look at examples of how that can look. And another important element in this process is that on the level of the child's developing sense of self, here's a powerful statement: the child cannot allow him or herself to feel like a good person in a bad environment. Yeah, like young children don't yet have the capacity to differentiate between themselves and what happens outside. Like they will take everything to mean something about themselves. In psychoanalytic language, is called primary narcissism of a child. So what that means is that if it feels bad, it must be my fault. If it feels bad, that means I must be bad. So that's what we call the child internalizes the environmental failure. They make it their fault. And that's, of course, the origin of shame, which lies at the very base of developmental trauma dynamics. That sense of toxic shame at the base of a child's, later the adult's identity. And so moving to the right side of the slide here that you see, what we can say is that based on the exact time and the exact nature of the environmental failure that a child experiences, the child will then develop very specific, what we call adaptive survival styles. And these adaptive survival styles basically consist of distorted beliefs, distorted sense of identity, shame-based ways of thinking about him or herself, and repressed emotion, and a dysregulation of the various systems of the body. So it impacts these, like, adaptive survival styles have a top-down component, like an identity distortion component, as well as a bottom-up, a body component. Both end up being dysregulated. Right, so that was a good bunch of theory I've thrown at you already. Let's change tune here for a moment. And I want to invite you to just take a minute or two with me to engage in a short experiential exercise. And I do this in the context of us beginning to look into how in NARM we work with these patterns, these adaptive survival styles that cause so much pain. So if you want to take a moment, if that works for you, of course you don't have to, but if you're up for it, then please take a moment to bring to mind an experience that you've had in your life where you felt really safe and or really connected. That may have been a moment when you felt really seen by another, or a beautiful moment in nature, or whatever it may have been for you. Just take a moment to bring such an experience to mind where you felt very safe, very connected. And then as you reflect on that experience, just simply notice how that is for you, what you're experiencing physically, emotionally, or energetically. Just give you another couple of moments with this. Just noticing your experience as you reflect on the experience of having felt safe or connected. So of course I can't know what happened in your particular experience right now, but you may have experienced a subtle shift toward feeling just a little bit more present, or a little bit more settled, or more centered, or more open, or any of these kinds of qualities. If not, that's totally fine. So yeah, as we brought attention to a feeling of safety and connection, then many people then experience a shift toward feeling more settled, more present. And in NARM, we actually consider the state of connection our natural state. And let me show you here a powerful quote from Lawrence Heller, Dr. Lawrence Heller, who came up with this NARM model. I'll give you a moment to read this. So what this statement refers to is that in NARM, we acknowledge and we deeply trust in this organismic impulse toward balance, toward homeostasis, toward health, toward healing. In any organism, including the human organism, we have a deep trust in that force, which of course creates a specific paradigm, a specific philosophy in this approach. What that means is that as therapists, we don't actually have to force or manufacture healing. Instead, we trust that the impulse toward healing already lives in the person that we work with, even if they're troubled, even if they come with a lot of symptoms. And our job then as therapists then becomes simply to inquire into what gets in the way of, let's say, a more full manifestation of this impulse toward healing and aliveness and connection. In other words, how does the client block through their learned adaptive survival styles and strategies? How does the client block this spontaneous movement toward connection and healing? And that's really the main inquiry that we offer to the client. And so now let's take a look at how we address exactly this simple, profound question in the NARM work. So as I said a minute ago, fundamentally speaking, what we do in NARM is to support our clients in this ongoing fundamental process of inquiry. What are the patterns that are preventing me from being present to myself and others at this moment and in my life? In other words, how does the client continue to relate to him or herself and other people in the world through these adaptive survival styles? They're like filters, these adaptive survival styles. And they're strategies of disconnection from who the person authentically actually is. So in a way, the opposite of connection and presence. And notice how in this question on the slide, there's already an element of agency built in. Agency as in, how does the client actively, it may not be conscious, but still actively organize his or her reality, his or her internal world? How do they actively disconnect moment by moment, even if it's not yet conscious? And so with this inquiry that we explore on all levels of experience, cognitive, emotional, relational, behavioral, on all levels, we support the client in moving from seeing the world and experiencing themselves through what we call child consciousness. We support them from, again, like existing more child consciousness to moving more toward what we call embodied adult consciousness, which means, which comes with way more capacity to be present and connected and alive. Another way more poetic way to express this process of inquiry is encapsulated here in this beautiful quote by Rumi, which I really love. It says, "Your task is not to seek love, but only to seek and find all the obstacles within yourself that you have developed against it." I think that just captures such a beautiful way of looking at our human condition. So once again, we trust that the person has in themselves all the resources that they need to heal and come back to more connection and aliveness and contact with their authentic self. So this inquiry that we just talked about is organized around what we call in NARM a core conflict. And let's remember one more time that the child growing up in a difficult environment needed to make a fundamental choice. In order to protect the attachment relationship, in order to try and secure the parent's love, he or she needed to disconnect from her core needs and at least parts of his or her authentic self. So that was the core conflict at the beginning of life. And the child has to choose between either their authentic self or the love of their parents. Now, how do we translate this understanding into the therapeutic work? Well, it shows in that quote here, because when clients come to us later, they are still stuck in that core conflict in their child consciousness. They may really want to reconnect with parts of themselves, but at the same time, they will be deeply afraid of that. A part of them still expects that if they connect more with themselves or show up more authentically, that they will be shamed or rejected or hurt or punished, just like back then. So depending on the specific core need, that is of course related to the specific age where the trauma happened, there's then a specific core conflict around that particular need. And then children then carry that core conflict forward with them right into adulthood. And you have those specific core needs listed at the right side of the slide. They revolve around connection, attunement, trust, autonomy, and love and sexuality. So we want to have access to our core needs, but at the same time, that's deeply frightening and scary. So let's take a closer look at how exactly the child then learns to foreclose, which means disconnect from, authentic parts of him or herself to protect the attachment relationship. And these are very specific ways depending on each survival style, period of importance of core need. So the child, in other words, has to come up with or develop strategies of disconnection from specific parts of him or herself. So in the connection survival style, where it's all about ideally giving the child a basic sense of feeling welcome and to be connected to this planet Earth and each other and feeling safe here. When that doesn't go well and when there's trauma here, the children end up disconnecting from themselves, from their bodies, and also from others, from social engagement. So they sacrifice the need of connection in order to secure the parental love. With the second survival style that revolves around attunement needs, children then end up giving up their own sense of attunement to their own needs. They no longer have access to feeling their needs. They disconnect from having needs in order to then focus on the needs of other people. It's usually the parents in the beginning. So that's the adaptation in the second survival style. With the trust survival style, by the way, connection survival style is the very, very beginning of life. Time in the womb, prenatal time, right up to about 6 months of age. With the second survival style, the attunement survival style, that's from 6 months to about like 1.5 years, 2 years, 18 months, something like that. And then the next two survival styles, trust and autonomy, are around 2 to 4 years of age. And in the phase where developing trust is so critical for a child, when that isn't being supported, when the child doesn't learn that he or she can trust others and have that sense of healthy relying on others, healthy interdependence, then children will learn to disconnect from that need for trust and end up turning this around and only trusting themselves and developing kind of like a false self, the self that they believe is expected of them. With the autonomy survival style, the child gives up their direct expression of independence, of their capacity to say no, to set boundaries, in order to just comply and fit in, to only do what they think is expected of them. And so you can see what profound adaptations children need to make to get to those stages of their development when there's trauma there. With the last one, what's called the love sexuality survival style, the child needs to then foreclose, push down, disconnect from their love and or their connection to the beginning of sexuality. Of course, it's it's an early shape of sexuality, but that's what they have to disconnect from, or disconnect from the coexistence, a healthy integration of love and sexuality, and they will end up striving for perfection in order to get the approval that they think they need. So a brief window into the exact nature of these survival styles adaptations. And of course, like I said a minute ago, it's not like this stops after childhood. We all have carried elements of this forward into our adult life. And we continue to use these strategies as if our survival still depended on them, although we may be 30, 40, 50, 60 years of age. And so we call this being identified with child consciousness, which means still experiencing ourselves at a deep level through the lens of a child. And the therapeutic process in NARM is about making those strategies conscious and working through those underlying core conflicts to help resolve them. And with this, also, as I touched on earlier, we can then support increasing embodied adult consciousness, the capacity to experience ourselves and life with more freedom in the moment, more free from the grip of these adaptive survival styles. Now let's take a look at, briefly, at the clinical model of what we actually do in a NARM session. How do we translate this clinical understanding that we have around the core conflict and the adaptive survival styles? How do we translate that into actually working with people in a session? How do we, as clinicians, work with the problems and with the symptoms that people bring to us that are based on developmental trauma? And this is quite succinctly described in the NARM model of the 4 pillars. I'll touch on them briefly, just so you get an initial sense of what these 4 pillars stand for. The first pillar is touching on the fact, or speaking to the fact, that all our exploration with the client, all our inquiry with the client, is based on the client's intention. What is it that they want for themselves from the therapy? Yeah, we need to find that out at the very beginning of our work with them, and actually later on, ideally also at the beginning of each session. And this might sound like an obvious thing to do, that we ask the client, well, what is it that they want for themselves from therapy? But it may not be as obvious as you initially think. Like, for many therapists, it's not an obvious thing. They have a habit of trying to make it their job to figure out what the client needs and then how they can give it to them. It's very widespread. And of course, for that, they will end up having to use their own effort. So now we do this differently. We start the work with clarifying what the person wants for themselves. And once we know that, then we can organize the inquiry around what gets in the way of them having access to what they want. You see how that's such a simple orientation, paradigm shift, actually, compared to many other approaches. So, for example, that could mean like a person would want to develop more confidence, more of a sense of confidence, so they can, next time, speak up to their boss if the boss doesn't treat them nicely. Yeah. So then once we know that, then we would simply start exploring with them what gets in the way of them having access to that confidence. The second pillar, we already talked about this quite a bit, means we inquire and we explore. That's really what we do mostly in a session with the client. We inquire and we explore. We're curious. This is our main technique in NARM. We bring our genuine and heartfelt curiosity to how the client organizes their inner world. And this inquiry, of course, hopefully, if it goes well, shines light then on all the unconscious ways how a client still operates from child consciousness, and supports them in taking steps toward more embodied adult consciousness. Pillar 3 relates to agency. Agency means we help the client realize how they're actually organizing their inner world, that things aren't just happening to them, that the problems and the symptoms that they have aren't just things that are happening to them, but that they're actually directly involved in their experience. With that, of course, comes the power to make changes. Once it's clear that I'm involved in my inner world, in a way that it can actually also change certain things. So this is a very empowering step as a client gains more access to agency. And finally, the fourth pillar, that relates mainly to how we work with the body and the nervous system directly in NARM. And how that looks in practice is that if and when we notice shifts in a session toward more connection, more aliveness, more presence in the client, we immediately pick that up and reflect those back to the client and help the client notice those shifts, and then take some time with them. And as we give space for the client to absorb these shifts in the body, this is actually where those shifts get anchored in the system at a really deep level, like at a cellular level. So this is where the transformation, we can say, happens at a bodily cellular level. So I mean, there's way more complexity to each one of those pillars, but I just wanted to touch on them initially so you have a sense. Right. Let's do, I think, just one more slide. There's so much information I'm throwing at you. So let's look briefly at kind of like a comparison between NARM and many other models. So what is NARM and what isn't NARM? So let's go briefly to those qualities that are listed there. So non-reductionistic, what that means is that we don't ever reduce people to their symptoms or to their diagnosis. We always keep an open mind and we explore their inner world with curiosity and respect. NARM is very much present moment focused. We work and acquire in the here and now. We only work with history and historical details in their life and their biography if and when it's helpful for the process, if the history surfaces. So we don't usually ask those classic therapeutic questions about, so when in your childhood did this start, or tell me about your mother back then. We work in the present moment. We trust that this material will surface on its own if and when it's ready. We strengthen, we support embodied adult consciousness in the here and now. We don't encourage regression. It's kind of like a sub-element of what I just talked about. And another kind of radical paradigm shift in this work is that we actually work so in the present moment that we only explore how clients carry forward the adaptation to trauma in the here and now. We could almost say that like there is no such thing as trauma, but what there is how we have adapted to trauma and how we continue to adapt to the trauma that happened back then in the present moment. And that is the focus of our exploration in NARM. We don't come from a goal-oriented kind of place. We're not goal-oriented. Instead, we just, like I said already a couple of times, we just explore what gets in the way of the client's goal. So we don't try to get the person anywhere. Resource-oriented, as in we always look for the health, for the resource. We trust the organismic life force. We don't focus on pathologies and symptoms. Of course, we acknowledge them, we work with them, but they aren't our focus. It's driven by genuine interest. This is so important. Like we really, somebody's just coming to join us later. We really, as a NARM therapist, you really want to come with genuine curiosity, a heartfelt curiosity to your client's inner world. You never have a goal for them. You never try and fix them. And that communicates something to them at a subtle level. And NARM is containment focused, which means we support increasing capacity to be with all of life, to be with all the intensity that, we meet in life. In other words, there's nothing that we try to get rid of. We don't focus on symptom relief. We don't try and get rid of symptoms. Instead, we work through the deeper adaptive survival styles that cause the symptoms. And as we do that, the symptoms usually resolve by themselves. And coming back to the fourth pillar I spoke about a minute ago, all the inquiry is only focused based on the client's intention. So we don't have an agenda for them, and the therapy is not led by us, it's led by the client's intention. Right. So I'm exactly 45 minutes into this. That's pretty good news, because now that can take us to the last slide I have for you, which would again invite you to a closing little experiential exercise after having taken in all the cognitive information. I'd like you to just simply take a moment or two to bring a sense of curiosity and a sense of openness to your own experience, whatever it is right now. So this is more about the quality that you bring to your own experience than what your experience actually is. So, and you don't have to get this right, just about inviting an attitude of curiosity or friendliness or openness, kind of an attitude that you would offer to a good friend if they come and meet you and share what's going on for them. I'd just like you to take a minute and notice what you're experiencing in response to these, bringing this curiosity to your experience. Good. Well, thank you for exploring that little exercise with me. And that brings us to a big thank you from my side for, I've actually experienced a collective field that's very present and very attuned. So I want to thank you for that. And then from here, we can move over. And hopefully, there will be some questions that you may have. If so, you can either chat them or grab the mic. And I'm actually going to stop the screen share at this point, so I get to see you all. So yes, feel free to double check anything with me that may have stood out for you, anything that wasn't quite clear. I'm also open to any reflections, anything that comes to mind. I'd be very happy. I see your hand up, Karima.
Maybe we could stop recording now?
Yes, that's a good moment for us to stop recording. That's right.